Hello, welcome to the Restorative Practices module. I am Dr. Angela Ward, a restorative practitioner in the Austin Independent School District, Central Administration. I'm excited to speak with you today about restorative practices and want to provide a little bit of context around this module. So when we think about restorative practices, what is popularized in society around restorative practices is discipline, it's justice, it's trauma-informed. What we offer for you as you engage in this module is to think about restorative practices from its original indigenous roots. Restorative practices was actually gifted to our Western culture by people who are indigenous to the land under which we stand on. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout this module. Restorative practices is thousands of years old. It was not created in the criminal justice system, although it has been popularized there. So we look forward to you engaging with this module. As a participant online, you will need a writing utensil as well as the handout. Welcome to the Restorative Practices Pathway in TIER's Mental Health module. This pathway aims to build awareness of restorative practices as a tool to develop identity-affirming schools and classrooms for the students in our care. So what is the purpose of education? We ask this question as we begin this module because we want you to consider when you begin your journey toward becoming an educator, you had a unique perspective on the purpose of education. In your handout, there's a section on your unique perspective. I want you to take a few moments to write one word or short phrase that represents your perspective of the purpose of education or why you feel education exists. Now that you've thought a little bit about the purpose of education, we want you to consider your everyday practice. Whether you are a classroom teacher, teacher's assistant, office staff member, assistant principal, central office staff member, school board member, you have a philosophy of education that drives the way you make decisions for the students in your care. Our personal practice, or the ways in which we work daily, are influenced by our personal philosophy of education as well. For this next activity, consider what does your everyday practice look and sound like in service of the students in your care? How does your everyday practice connect to your belief of the purpose of education? Write your thoughts in the Your Unique Perspective spot of your handout. Your praxis is the integration of your educational philosophy with your everyday practice, making decisions for the students in your care. A recognition of your praxis will assist you as you work to develop identity-affirming school and classroom environments for students and adults. We first invited you to write about your personal philosophy of education. Then we invited you to explore your everyday practice. Now we invite you to consider what your personal educational praxis looks, sounds, and feels like. Take the next 3 minutes or so to write your thoughts in the Unique Perspective section of your handout. In this session, we want to invite you to consider your unique perspective as well as the perspectives of others. So in this next activity, you will discuss your personal educational praxis with one person near you if you are viewing this with more than one person. As you are sharing, take care to share the talking space and actively listen so that you hear your partner's perspectives and your partner hears your perspectives. Because we have limited time, please speak only to one person at this point because it is also important that each person has time to speak. Next, for those who are watching this module with more than one person, share with a pair near you if there's multiple people in your space. Consider what you and your partner discussed and what you might share with this new pair. Take care to share the talking space and actively listen. Be sure to explore your perspectives, your partner's perspectives, and also the new pair's perspectives. Just like the Think, Turn, Talk activity we just participated in, as adults working to nurture identity-affirming schools and classrooms, your unique perspective and the perspectives of the students in your care are very important. The next segment of this session will focus on culture as a key component to developing identity-affirming schools and classrooms. Throughout this module, we would like you to consider these ideas. Culturally responsive praxis is influenced by your race, your ethnicity or culture, your beliefs, your values, your bias, and your unique lens shows in your work and ultimately affects the success of each student in your care. So next we're about to introduce a few guest speakers who will share how they use a culturally responsive praxis to implement restorative practices on an elementary campus and a secondary campus. Our first guest speaker is Principal Letty Pena of Blazier Elementary School in the Austin Independent School District. She will discuss how she engaged her staff in dialogue and learning about culture to build a foundation for culturally responsive praxis on her campus. Relational capacity is key as we endeavor to build our capacity to operate as restorative practitioners. As you listen to her speak, consider the question on the slide. Does this video affirm, add to, or challenge your personal educational praxis?
Starting off at the campus level with my staff, before even moving into the work we were doing with students, we really needed to examine, what does culture mean? What is that word for you? What does that word mean for me? What does it mean for your colleague down the hallway? And really gaining an understanding, an awareness, an appreciation for what that means for one another. And then how do we bring that into what we do on our campus? Because not only do we have our own personal culture, our own personal experience, but then we bring those pieces into our greater school culture. And so really trying to have those really authentic conversations with my staff first, teachers, counselors, principal, assistant principal, the office staff, and really understanding how your own culture, your own background, your own experiences impact the work you do here with kids, whether it's in the office, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the cafeteria, and how it contributes to the greater culture of the school. And so that's a real important piece. It's a very important conversation that doesn't just happen on the onset at the beginning. It has to continue throughout the process. It has to be revisited. It has to be really given time for staff and for adults, the adults in the building, to really discuss and understand about one another.
Okay.
But I really needed for them to, teachers and for myself and for my admin staff and my counselors and anybody that worked with kids, to really understand what restorative practices does for students in the classroom, how it can impact and grow relationships within the classroom, and how you have to absolutely consider and take really think about culture as a part, the students' culture as a part of that.
Now, on your video reflections handout, write your response to the question in the space for video 1. What Principal Pena shares in the video connects to the 7 core assumptions from the Heart of Hope book, A Guide for Using Peacemaking Circles to Develop Emotional Literacy, Promote Healing, and Build Healthy Relationships. This book and the approach was developed for the Institute for Restorative Services by Carolyn Boyes Watson and Kay Pranis. These assumptions are outlined on the slide. We use this book to really help us develop a culturally responsive approach to Tier 1 of the restorative process. These assumptions about humans form the foundation to a culturally responsive approach to restorative practices. These basic ideas relate to what we believe about human nature and our relationships to the world. We begin our session focused on your personal educational praxis. We did so to aid you in thinking about yourself as a cultural being who has particular experiences. Your experiences shape your worldview and ultimately affect the way you make decisions for the students in your care. It is important to be aware of your core assumptions because what we believe shapes what we see. Our beliefs form the prism through which we see ourselves and others. The 7 core assumptions ground restorative practices in their indigenous roots. As culturally responsive educators, we honor the roots of restorative practices in indigenous communities around the world. We recognize that restorative practices are thousands of years old. They were not created in the criminal justice or social work field. Practitioners in those fields studied indigenous communities in New Zealand and elsewhere. What they uncovered were the ways these communities maintained harmony and connection, but also dealt with harm and conflict. Indigenous communities are often collectivistic and value one another. As educators, we are responsible for understanding the true history of these practices, not a revisionist history. We are also responsible to the land that we inhabit and those who were here prior to European colonialism. The creators of this presentation live in Central Texas and honor tribal nations indigenous to that region: the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Comanche, and the Coahuiltecan. We encourage you, if you're viewing this from another region of the state of Texas, to research tribal nations indigenous to your region. Restorative practices are most effective when founded on a multi-tiered system of support. Much like MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, restorative practices follow a tiered model of intervention and engagement with students. We follow this research-based model for intervening with students in schools for social, emotional, behavioral, and academic development. We have provided the Whole School Restorative Practices and Multi-Tiered Systems of Support handout for you to take notes as we discuss these tiers. Restorative practices begin, as Principal Pena described, with building the relational capacity necessary to nurture trust and to operate as restorative practitioners. Affective statements and questions require adults and students to share, as we have modeled in this session. The think, turn, talk, and think, write strategies we've modeled help us envision using these practices in everyday instruction. Students in an affective learning environment can ask questions about the curriculum and issues they are dealing with that might impede their academic success. Small impromptu conferences provide the first step in classroom-level intervention that many students need to stay connected to the teacher and other adults, as well as to know that someone on the campus cares and has their best interest in mind. Large groups and informal conferences are needed as students advance and encounter more academic difficulty. Often we uncover at the large and formal conferences that the root cause of difficulty was one or more failed relationships in the student's school and home experiences. At the universal tier, we engage all students and provide universal interventions for academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs. At this tier, we strive to build a firm relational foundation with students by working to understand their culture, worldview, and lived experiences, so we can monitor and adjust how we support their development of the skills to build relationships with peers and with adults. In the next video, we welcome back Principal Letty Pena. As you listen, consider what she shares about practices in the universal tier, also known as Tier 1, and how she defines equity at this tier. As you listen, think about the question on the slide. What resonates with you?
Because the structure of a restorative circle is one that is very meaningful. It's very personal. You have to understand your students' backgrounds. You have to understand the culture that they come from. You have to understand the environment that the community and the environment that we work and live in. You have to understand what's going on in the world if you're going to bring all of these, if you're going to bring a topic in and all these ideas into this kind of sacred place. You have to take all those things into consideration. And in order for that restorative experience to truly be impactful, to truly be authentic, for students to feel safe in it and be able to grow from it. The idea of we're at this tier 1 level of restorative practices doesn't mean every classroom is going to do it the same. Every teacher is going to do it the same, that every student in a classroom needs the same type of restorative experience. You have to consider your children's background, their culture. You have to meet them where they are. That's the whole idea behind equity, is understanding one another's backgrounds, understanding the culture they come from, understanding how they were raised and the environment they live and breathe in. And those are all pieces that you need to take into that tier 1 level of bringing children together and talking about certain topics, but really understanding where each individual or where each classroom is at that given time.
Let's return to the video reflections portion of your handout. Take a few moments to respond to the question in the space for video 2. At the targeted tier, we engage a small portion of students in interventions and work toward repairing the relationships we establish in the universal tier. We are even more focused here, providing targeted interventions for the academic, social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of students. At this tier, we strive to address conflict in a relational and focused manner and create intervention cycles to monitor and adjust supports provided to students in our care. The relational foundation we set in the universal tier becomes very important at the targeted tier. We continue working to understand the student's culture, worldview, and experiences so we, as the adults, can monitor and adjust how we support their development of the skills to build and repair relationships with their peers and with adults. In the next video, we meet a new educator, McCallum High School Principal Brandy Hosack. She addresses each level of a whole school restorative process. She also discusses how educators teach academic skills, but fall short of teaching behavioral, social, and emotional skills to students. She advocates for teaching rather than pushing children out of the educational process. Note what she shares about the multi-tiered process and where personal educational praxis can at times conflict with student needs. As you watch, consider the questions on the slide. What resonates with you? How does she talk about equity in the context of social emotional skills development?
We work hard to make sure that our classrooms build community with one another, and that's level 1 is community building for restorative practices, and really just checking in with our students on an everyday basis, getting to know them on a personal level. And like you said, it's about every single student and being individualized. And so we have to know every student's story, and we have to know what drives them to be successful and what would motivate them. And we have to pull on those things to be able to establish that relationship and that solid foundation. So getting to know them is extremely important. Level 2, like a mediation of a conflict circle, those are much tougher conversations, but again, building on that level 1, that community, that relationship that's been built, those conversations are possible because that relationship's there. If we don't build that relationship, it's going to go nowhere. A student's not going to invest in us because we haven't invested in them. So without the relationship, it's impossible to to not only go to level 3, but hardly to go to level 2. And it's not just with students, it's with any humans. I mean, if we don't build relationship and if we don't have that level of trust, we're going to dig our heels in, we're going to stay in our corner, and we're going to go into defense mode rather than coming into a space that's safe for everybody, that we know the outcome is to find resolution, and your voice is respected, your experience is respected, and everybody's listened to. So practicing that in level 1 is of utmost importance, so that it's very natural by the time you get to level 2 and especially level 3. One of the driving forces behind me wanting to be a restorative practitioner was listening to some experts talk about social skills being it's a learned skill. It's something that we learn how to do. And if we are not taught, then how are we supposed to know how to do that? And we disconnect in education that often. For example, when a student is having reading difficulties, as educators, we throw reading supports at them. Whatever, like reading support until that student learns how to read. If they struggle in math, throw supports at them. Much in the same way that reading and math are skills, behavior is a skill, and yet we do not put the same level of support in front of a student to learn those skills. We expect for our students to show up at the door having learned those skills. We don't suspend a student for not knowing how to read. We don't suspend a student for not knowing how to do math, but we suspend a student for not knowing how to quote unquote act. And so our practices and our responses are misaligned. So we have to put the same level of supports in for behavior, for social emotional development, as we do any other sort of development. And so that's really the driving force behind that, is treating it as a learned skill, and we have to be the teachers of the same skills that we do for other things. Mm-hmm. We can understand that when it comes to an academic, we don't give it the same respect when it comes to an SEL skill, a social emotional behavior skill. And so equity is about, this is where this particular student is on their SEL continuum, if you will. How do we meet them where they are and build their capacity? And we need to give it the same level of respect, and that's equity to me.
Thank you. Returning to your video reflections portion of the handout, take a few moments to respond to the questions in the space for video 3. At the intensive tier, we engage a much smaller portion of the student population. Research suggests that if we build community at the universal tier and repair relationships and intervene efficiently at the targeted tier, only 1 to 5% of the student population will need services at the intensive tier. In my experience in over 20 years as a public school educator, I've built community at Tier 1 with students and staff, and assisted the positive identity development of students at Tier 2, never needing to advance to Tier 3 intensive supports. At this tier, we admit that we need to provide additional supports for students in our care. We, and I, have done in the past and continue to do, partner with the community and provide wraparound services where needed to support the academic, social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of students. We strive to address conflict, repair harm, and rebuild relationships. We don't push students out. We continue to engage intervention cycles to monitor and adjust supports that we provide to students. The relational foundation we set at the universal tier is very important at this intensive tier. At this tier, we may have difficulty getting to the root cause of behavioral, social, emotional, or academic issues for a student. To overcome this challenge, we continue working to understand the student's culture, worldview, and experiences so we can monitor and adjust how much support and the development of the skills to rebuild relationships with peers and adults. In this next video, Principal Brandy Hosack speaks about a student in the intensive tier of the whole school restorative practices process, also known as Tier 3. As she leads this work, she recognizes that an equity lens is needed for the planning and development of a whole school process. Equity in planning and development means that each adult takes ownership for their personal educational praxis and their personal sphere of influence to develop a child-centered, identity-affirming, whole school restorative practices process. Remember that she is a principal. If you are not a principal, consider your role in the success of a whole school restorative practices process. Whether you are a teacher, teacher aide, office staff member, athletic coach, instructional coach, counselor, custodian, bus driver, school board member, or central office staff member, you have a personal sphere of influence to support the development of an identity-affirming school and classroom environment. Consider your role and what you have control over in developing such an environment. As you watch, consider the questions on the slide. What resonates with you? As you consider your role and personal sphere of influence, what sticks with you?
At my former school, I was where we introduced restorative practice whole school. I have one particular young female that comes to mind, and she was put out of school, suspended, disconnected from the school community over and over and over again for behavior. And
that was in your school or multiple schools?
It was in her entire academic career.
So elementary, middle, and high?
Yes, ma'am. A pattern of doing something, quote unquote, wrong, put out of school, and it was just this vicious cycle. And so I remember as we were, implementing restorative practices on that campus, she didn't necessarily stop doing things that were against the rules, if you want to say that, but the way that we were able to start to approach her and have the conversation changed. When we put down, our administrator role or our teacher role, and we start getting on that human level and treat a student as a human, the conversation changes. And so she started to build trust with us, and on the days that she had great days, then we could really build that community and really celebrate some things that she was doing very well. And we invested in her and what her life was about, and so we got to learn about her challenges and what was in her bag that she was bringing with her every single day, so that when we did have to have those conversations, we had more of a respect for where she's coming from. She had more of a respect with, maybe I can trust these people a little bit more. Maybe they do want me here. Maybe they are trying to fix a problem. As we work through those level 1, sometimes level 2, every now and then a level 3, the level 3s decreased. And over time, she actually became quite the champion for restorative conversation. So trusting in the process and learning that we believe that you are human. We believe that you have things that add value to this place, and we want to know about those things. At the same time, we want you to have respect for the space that you're in, and us work together.
Returning to your video reflections portion of the handout, take a few moments to respond to the questions in the space for video 4. In the video, Principal Hosack shared the process and the consistency needed to build trust with her student. The social discipline window provides a visual for us as we consider what she shared. Public schools historically have responded to student conflicts using a punishment model. This model reinforces the educator as decision maker, eliminating the ability of the student to lift any of the cognitive load to question and process what other behaviors can be chosen in the same situation. In his work with restorative justice, which happens at Tier 3 of the process presented in this module, Ted Wachtel offers a more useful view of the social discipline window. Rather than looking at the response to conflict as simply punitive or permissive, the social discipline window looks at the interplay of two variables and provides educators with the teaching and planning tool. Control is defined as limit setting. Control in this sense moves from high teacher or educator control to high student control for chosen behaviors and decision-making regarding those behaviors. Control in this sense is not about controlling another person. In an equity-focused restorative practices process, the student takes on a collaborative role in the decision-making process and is able to take ownership for decisions they have made with regard to behavior. Support here is defined as encouragement and nurturing. In looking at the model, we can see the interplay of control and support. Without the interplay of both variables, low control and low support leads to neglect. High control without support maintains the punitive and authoritarian model public schools historically adhere to. High support with low control leads to a permissive environment and limits the ability of students to develop as independent learners. Lastly, an approach that is high in control and high in support is a restorative approach. As Principal Hosak's story illustrates, a restorative approach confronts student and staff conflict while supporting and valuing the intrinsic worth of the student. As much as possible, a whole school restorative practices process must work with students. This means that we use affective statements and questions in dialogue so students share with us when they experience uncertainty and difficulty. This means that interventions must have structures and protocols aligned to the process Principal Hosak shared. We must build an awareness of our personal educational praxis and how it aligns to creating and nurturing identity-affirming school and classroom environments, so we build the relational capacity to interrupt potential school violence. Considering your personal sphere of influence, how can you use the social discipline window as a guide for planning with staff members to build child-centered, identity-affirming systems, processes, and protocols at each tier? In our last video, we returned to Principal Letty Pena, who offers some practical ideas about how she nurtures a culturally responsive staff and the dedication to professional learning that is required to do this work well. As you consider next steps for you and your organization, consider the process that she describes to get her staff to build an awareness of personal educational praxis and personal worldview, and how this work affects student success. As you watch, think about the question on the slide. As you consider your role and personal sphere of influence, what sticks with you?
As we were starting the work, we began with a small group of staff here at Blazier. It was a pocket of teachers that I knew already had done some work in this area and were really bought into and very committed already to making those connections in the classroom with their students and building those relationships, and really had an understanding for the students' backgrounds and how to bring that into the work that they do every day with kids. So that was a very easy process, because as soon as I brought the idea of restorative practices and told them, look, let me tell you what I saw at this school, and let me tell you the impact that it's making, they bought into it right away and wanted to bring that structure and that kind of conversation with kids into their classrooms. And we started it with a second, a fourth, and a fifth grade teacher, and it was excellent. It was a great way to have our campus dip their toe into this new structure. As that developed, I began to get some interest from teachers on the campus level. And then I began to really see that, okay, this work is catching the eye and the ear of other teachers around the school. One of the first steps that we took was bringing our entire campus together to then get some training within restorative practices and some professional development on what that looks like. And even have some opportunity for our teachers to practice with one another. After that, I was able to select a group of teachers, probably about 15 teachers on my campus, to go to a Beyond Diversity professional development. I'd been through it myself, and I absolutely loved the experience. And after the second experience, I knew that this was something I absolutely had to bring to my campus. I started slow with a group of about 15 teachers, and those teachers engaged in those courageous conversations with other teachers and other community members. That experience for my teachers really set the ball rolling. They came back to me, and from that point said, we are ready for this work. We're ready to start bringing other people in. The most recent experience has been bringing in representatives from AISD, yourself, and your wonderful, wonderful team that came in and delivered Isolating Race. And that was with an entire campus that we were able to really engage in some crucial, very courageous conversations with teachers that were at various levels in this work. It was a great experience for us to learn from one another, to learn about the work we do with kids, and really develop some plans moving forward this year. One of the other things that we're doing in conjunction with that work and that conversation is a book study there with Zaretta Hammond book with Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, which we have worked on this entire first semester because we really believed we needed to take it very slow. It wasn't going to be a sit and get. We are really engaging in conversation and doing that through restorative circles with our own staff, led by our teachers that have gone through this process, gone through Beyond Diversity, gone through Isolating Race, and are actually doing the work in the classroom. And they are now my leaders in the circles. So it's been a really great development over the past 3 or so years, but most recently this past year, the work is really moving at a new level that we're really excited about.
In the video reflections portion of your handout, write your answers to the question in the space for video 5. As we close out this module, we want to invite you to consider professional learning opportunities. Visit the Texas Education Agency website. The Restorative Discipline Practices page provides tools such as the Fidelity Continuum Scale, data collection sheet, and sample lesson plans. Additionally, the Texas Education Agency offers standalone and online training opportunities. Visit the Texas Gateway for more information. Information about both of these resources is provided in the Professional Learning Resources handout. This module has been simply an introduction to a culturally responsive and equity-centered approach to whole school restorative practices. As a researcher and as a practitioner, I understand that your local and personal context will really influence how you're able to engage in this work collectively. So here in this portion, we invite you to consider your next steps, including what timelines, milestones, people that you need to engage with. What are your personal and collective next steps to develop an identity-affirming and identity-safe learning environment for your students? We leave you with this quote as you consider your personal sphere of influence to create identity-affirming schools and classrooms for the students in your care in Texas public schools. When someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. Thank you for participating in our module.